A bookstore manager meets a girl with whom he will fall in love immediately, but this love will quickly become an obsession, while he will eliminate any obstacles or people who crosses his path. This story takes place in New York, where we meet Joe, the manager of a bookstore, and Beck, a college student, aspiring writer, who, when buying a book, ends up giving him her name, which is more than enough for him to start looking for her on social networks, and ends up discovering where she was born, who are her friends, what she studies, even where she lives. Joe starts spying on her and one night discovers that Beck has a friend with benefits, Benji, so he decides to leave. Returning home, we meet Joe's neighbor, Paco, who likes to read, so he takes him to the bookstore to lend him a new book, and shows him a cage in which the best editions of the books are kept. And when they are returning home, they bump with Ron, Paco's mother's abusive partner, who threatens Joe to get away from Paco. Joe follows Beck to a bar, where she meets her friends, Lynn, Annika and Peach. But when Beck starts reading her poetry, people start teasing her, so he decides to leave. Minutes later, a drunk Beck appears and falls on the train tracks, but Joe ends up saving her. When he takes her home, he steals her phone, and although Beck buys a new one, her old phone is still connected to the cloud, so Joe ends up having access to her conversations and finds out everything. Joe sends Benji a fake message to meet him in the bookstore, and when they go down to the basement, he hits him on the head and locks him in the book's cage. In order not to raise suspicions of Benji's disappearance, Joe begins to create false evidence so that Beck becomes angry with Benji, and in that way he can have a free way to conquer her. After a few days, Joe and Beck kiss for the first time, so Joe decides it's time to get rid of Benji. He gives him a coffee with peanut oil, and since he is allergic, he dies. 3 days have passed, and Benji's body keeps getting damaged in the basement, so Joe asks Paco to buy a few products that will help him get rid of Benji's body. With Benji out of the way, Joe begins to focus on what really matters to him, his relationship with Beck, and when Joe's finally going to get lucky, he doesn't even last 8 seconds. But this uncomfortable moment is broken when Beck receives a message from a guy with whom she ends up staying with to go to a festival. Joe follows her and discovers that the person she's been texting with is her father, that she spends her time telling everyone that he is dead, but it turns out that he has another family. Beck discovers Joe, but he tells her he decided to go there to apologize for having finished in 8 seconds, and when they return home, Beck surprises him in his apartment, and this time, they get lucky the right way. When it seemed everything was starting to go well in their relationship, Joe realizes there's still an obstacle to their happiness, the friendship between Beck and Peach. But Joe notices Peach is obsessed with her, and when he tells Beck, she gets angry with him. But she realizes that Joe was right when Peach introduces her to a friend who is a famous literary agent, but that in the end all he wanted was to take advantage of her, and tells her all the things Peach says about her behind her back, so they end up fighting. Hours later, Peach calls her to tell her that she's taken all the pills she had, so Beck runs to help her, and when they are there, Joe realizes that Peach planned everything, and that she's smarter than he thought. So to get rid of her, Joe follows her on her morning walk and hits her on the head with a rock. Joe returns home and discovers that Paco has drugged Ron, but manages to save him, and when Ron wakes up he ends up beating Joe. While trying to recover from the beat-up, he receives a call from Beck, and finds out Peach is alive. Peach takes Beck to a country house, where she proposes that they go together to Paris, but they are not alone, since Joe followed them to the country house, but on the way he suffered an accident, and begins to have hallucinations with his ex-girlfriend Candace, and starts walking around the house like a zombie. The next morning, Peach and Beck argue over several things, including the kiss Peach gave her last night, so Beck decides to leave. Minutes later, Joe is discovered by Peach, who manages to knock him down and threatens him with a gun. Joe tries to escape but ends up being shot, and when it looked like he was dead, he manages to take the gun from her, and Peach dies. Joe leaves a letter on her laptop where he makes it seem Peach ended up killing herself without anyone's help. Joe begins to suspect that Beck is cheating on him with her therapist, so he starts to follow her, but she discovers him and breaks up with him. Joe decides to go to therapy with Dr. Nikki, Beck's therapist, to find out if his suspicions were true, but when he listens to one of the therapy sessions, he realizes Beck is better off without him. So he decides to let her go. It's been 3 months since they broke up, and Joe is now dating Karen, while Beck is about to publish her first book. But one day, her friend deletes her social networks, and when Joe wants to look for her to know how she's doing, he doesn't find her anywhere, and goes crazy. One night they bump into each other, and Beck starts to text him, and after a while, they end up getting lucky, again and again. So Joe decides to break up with Karen, and try again with Beck. Karen bumps with Beck on the street, and leaves her wondering why Joe remains obsessed with his ex-girlfriend Candace. It turns out that Joe is so obsessed with Candace because she cheated on him with her manager, and Joe got so angry that he ended up pushing him from a building, killing him. After this incident, Candace decided to go to Italy, but the strange thing is that no one heard from her again, so some of her friends believe she's dead. When Beck finds out this, she decides to confront Joe, who explains her that after they broke up, Candace changed her name and opened other social networks, in which she publishes photos in Italy. Beck isn't entirely convinced, so Joe decides to take her to meet Mr. Mooney, who took care of him since he was a child, and is the owner of the bookstore. When they are leaving, Joe realizes that Beck is still receiving messages, so he decides to assault Dr. Nikki, and when he takes his phone, he discovers that Beck did have an affair with him, and when he was about to kill him, he regrets it. When he returns home, Joe asks Beck if she cheated on him with her therapist, and she says yes, but everything is fixed when she tells him that all that is over and that now she loves him. The next morning, Paco goes to return Joe a book he had lent him, and tells Beck to tell Joe to apologize him, because he had forgotten he hid it in the bathroom ceiling, where Joe taught him to hide things. Hearing this, Beck decides to go and find if Joe has anything hidden, and discovers a box in which he had stored all the evidence of his crimes. Joe returns home and realizes that Beck has found his box, and before she escapes, he stops her. Beck wakes up locked in the basement of the bookstore, while Joe tries to explain her the reasons why he killed Benji and Peach, but all he manages is for Beck to realize that he is crazy. When Joe returns home, he sees that Ron has beaten up Paco's mom, and ends up sending her to the hospital, but she doesn't report him to the police. Paco, tired of Ron continually beating up his mom, hits him with a bat in the head, but Ron gets up and chases him. Paco runs to hide, but Joe comes to help him and kills Ron. When he returns to see Beck, he finds her writing a story, in which she tells everything that happened, but instead of writing that Joe is the murderer, she incriminates Dr. Nikki so that they can be together at last. Beck convinces him to open the cage's door, and when he's inside, she stabs him with a typewriter key and locks him up. Once outside of the cage, Beck tells him all his truths to his face, like he's a psychopath and he's going to rot in jail. When she tries to escape, she finds that the basement's door is locked and asks Paco to open it because Joe is locked up, and that she already knows about the murders. When Paco hears this, he decides to leave. Beck runs down to find the keys, but Joe has escaped from the cage, so she hits him on the head, but it doesn't leave him unconscious, and when she's about to escape, he catches her. 4 months have passed, and we learn that Beck is dead. Joe used the story she wrote to incriminate Dr. Nikki of all the murders. And how the story was perfect, everyone believed it. And now that Beck is dead, she has finally become a famous writer. We see a girl enter the bookstore, and when Joe approaches her, he realizes it's his ex-girlfriend, Candace, whom he is amazed to see alive. And that's how the first season of You ends. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, so we can reach more people.